It's like, yeah, everyone wants to play first. It's like how I thought it might work. Yeah, well, look, even with the class, like, also, I haven't actually gone past. Yeah. Hi, Helen.
Hi, darling, best friend.
Seriously, never met. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
You were here for, just give me a photo, just, do the QR. Oh, yeah. That's, So yeah, all the variants.
I've got the stream working, but I'm not able to post the stream to Facebook. Like, it's just not letting me. Sorry. Tell her I did a live stream here in a minute. Oh. Cool, the streams are, but I just can't comment in the Facebook post.
Okay.
Can I message you the link and nothing's working on Facebook. It's really it's getting the watch frustration.
Message to Lynn.
Yeah,
Is
come
your
in and
internet
get.
maybe a bit screwed?
I mean, it's doing a lot.
Yeah.
If I try and email it to myself and then send it to you.
It is a bit slow, aren't they? Do you want to try and hook up to that Wi-Fi?
Yeah, it's just the streaming's working, and the streaming has enough. I'm just a bit reticent to switch networks. Yeah. Getting plenty signal is this really messing up. Try and message you the link so you can put it on the Facebook. Yeah. So I said that. Yeah. What's that? Can you put a link on? Use a link. Use a stream to the Facebook. No, that's the link. That's like to the that's just the YouTube one. Yeah. Eddie Jennings gonna try as well. Thanks very much. Yeah. Yeah. So did you already have that one? No, we
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh,
Okay, sorry, hopefully you guys can hear me now. Just had a few technical malfunctions. Sorry, it's got the same computer streaming as we have in the live space to do the presentation. So it's just taking a minute. Alrighty, we might start now, guys. And I'm hoping that people can hear me on the other side. People watching. Yeah, maybe chuck something in the live chat if you have a question or if you just want to let us know that it's working. If it's not working, just keep it to yourself, I think, at this stage. Alright, well, thanks heaps for having me here. Mark and Brett and Nick and everyone, Stick Street Ari. Yeah, and there's a gig here tonight already that's sold out, so it should be a pretty fun day. Yeah, I wanted to give a bit of a talk about some ideas I've had around modular synthesis kind of recently. I've been working with modular synths for just over 10 years, and I've become quite fascinated with what I see as kind of unique modular synthesizer-based ways of composing and structuring music. But most of the conversation that I've seen in kind of electronic music culture seems to assume that the resurgence of modular synthesizers is due to their analog nature or the wild possibilities for kind of timbre and sound design that they might offer, which is kind of a bit different than my experience of modular synthesis. So I started a PhD a couple of years ago with the intention of trying to kind of understand how modular synthesizers impact on the ways we compose music. And the stuff in this talk is really coming out of the literature research that I've done for that. So yeah, what I'm presenting today is largely come out of a paper that I've written for the journal Organized Sound, and that should be published later this year. The paper focuses on the relationships between modular synthesizers, tape-based music practices circa kind of 1950 to 1965, and improvisation and live performance. I'm kind of making a case for modular synthesizers through their historic development and historic and contemporary use to have more in common with digital audio workstation DAW, or the concept of a whole of studio as instrument approach, rather than they more in common with those things than they do with fixed architecture synthesizers. So I'm going to try and set the scene a little by talking about tape music to start. The term tape music, as I'm using it here, refers to music composed using discs or tape recorders and performed or played back from a fixed recording medium. Electronic music in the post-World War II setting was pretty much inseparable from tape recording technology. And the majority of electronic music produced from 1948 to the advent of synthesizers in the late 1960s was created using classical tape-based techniques, which included recording and intricate slicing of tape to then kind of construct compositions. Tape music is really commonly associated with Pierre Schaeffer and other composers associated with music concrete. But the electronic compositions that were developed in Germany as well as France at that time, associated with serialism like WDR studios and Stockhausen,
they were equally reliant upon tape-based studio techniques as the music concrete guys were. Because in order to create those serial pieces, they were intricately slicing, mixing, and re-recording in order to build those structures that they did from waveforms using test oscillators. And just as an example of a piece constructed from using these tape user techniques, this is the original theme to Doctor Who, as recorded and constructed by Delia Derbyshire. I don't know whether is my signal turned up on that. Maybe my streaming software is interrupting it. Hopefully people in the stream can hear it. Here that is. That's my fault, sorry. Yeah, so this is really well-known piece of music. It was created before synthesizers existed, and it was absolutely completely constructed by recording kind of short wave cycles from test oscillators and then adding them together and filtering them. It's a very laborious kind of process. So I just want to, to start with, the way I'm working with modular synthesizers, I'm kind of defining them as having three principal features, one being multiple independent components that can be configured together in kind of a range of ways, and using a method of voltage control to kind of communicate between those components. And for the purposes of creating or modifying sound in real time. Just want to do a really quick segue about voltage control. Both voltage control and this idea of flexible interconnection of discrete modules were already key features of many analog computers, which were widely used in the military for fire control from the 1940s, and then more generalized engineering and scientific applications in the 1950s and 60s. This image you can see is of a Donner portable computer released in 1959. And if you look at that, it looks a lot like a modular synthesizer. So I think it's really interesting to think that ideas from analog computing kind of made their way into the design of the first modular synthesizers, as I'll kind of explain now. So Harold Bode designed and built the first modular synthesizer in 1959, 1960, and then he published a paper about it in 1961. Bode is also known for designing the Bode frequency shifter and a ring modulator, which were both later available as Moog modules under license. Bode also designed the Moog vocoder in the 1970s. I should also add that the use of voltage control in a musical context is also utilised by Hugh Lacane around this time, the Canadian. But Bode credited analog computing as the inspiration for this modular approach, enabling the creation of intricate electronic systems from modules with a limited number of basic functions. So in his modular synthesizer, essentially like the first modular synthesizer, it included a ring modulator and an envelope shaper, which was essentially a kind of a slew device. And Bode referred to these as audio control devices, where the sound signals were used to control the device. And Bode described his synthesizer as offering immediate processing of sounds and situates this in contrast to intermediate processes of sounds where the composer or performer cannot immediately hear or judge their performance. So what he's talking about there is when you're composing with classical kind of tape-based processes, you would have to kind of splice tape together and then re-record it, then listen back, then think about whatever adjustments you want to make, and then go and make those adjustments and then listen back. Whereas what Bode wanted was something that could happen immediately in real time, where you're hearing it and making adjustments as you're hearing it. Should also add that Bode is probably also referring to the RCA synthesizer, which is a gigantic kind of room size synthesizer in America that was, while it did produce signals in real time, to compose with it or to construct sound with it, you had to use a tape-based punch card system. So even though as you fed the punch cards into it or the punch tape into it, it would then perform in real time and you could record that, any compositional decisions you were making would have had to have been made kind of in an offline way. So he wanted to create something where you could do something immediately and hear what you're doing. So Bode's modular synthesizer also incorporated a tape loop device with a record head and 3 playback heads, which you can kind of see in the photo there. I think it's interesting that there was this integration of a tape loop into this device, into this first modular synthesizer. And I think, I don't know, to me that its intended functionality then sits a little bit awkwardly with common understandings of a synthesizer as a generator of signals and conceptually separate to recording devices. But this kind of idea of conflating tape and synthesis together isn't exclusive to Bode at all, as I'll go on to show. Robert Moog and Don Buchla are credited with developing the first commercial modular synthesizers at about the same time, between 1963 and 1965. Both of them make mention of Bode's design and were likely aware of it before they built their synthesizers. So, in the late 1950s and early 60s, interest in improvisation in the composition and performance of electronic music was building. However, classical tape processes did not lend themselves easily to real-time performance and improvisation. In 1961, a group of composers, including Pauline Oliveros, Terry Riley, and Raymond Sender, later joined by Morton Subotnick, began organising the Sonics concert series, which situated improvised music and presentations of tape music together for an audience. So they would have groups perform improvised pieces, and then they would listen to a tape together in a room, and that was kind of conceptually the idea of the Sonic series, of trying to bring electronic music and improvisation together. In 1962, that group established the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and the members' key interests were kind of in electronic music and improvised performance, and that formed a contradiction for them which they sought to solve, because at the time, with tape-based music processes, you couldn't really improvise all that much, and there was kind of limited possibilities, I guess. So Pauline Oliveros developed some techniques that allowed her to perform in real time with a reel-to-reel tape machine and a test oscillator, enabling her to hear the music as she was making it. And that was kind of like a major theme of Pauline Oliveros' work, of listening as a key part of performing. Oliveros also organised Tudor Fest in 1964, which was named for David Tudor and featured him as a performer and composer. Tudor Fest was focused on live performance of electronic music. Similarly, Raymond Sender was also exploring possibilities for improvisation in relation to tape music. He was experimenting with a chamberlin, which was a keyboard instrument that used multiple strips of tape and multiple reed heads to reproduce pre-recorded sounds, kind of like a mellotron, but much more primitive, as I understand it. And Sender had hoped to achieve playback of custom tapes and to enable music concrete techniques to be undertaken in real time with that system, but he kind of had limited success. And these motivations led to the engagement of Donald Buchla by Sender and Subotnick to develop a new electronic music for the San Francisco Tape Music Center. I should also mention that Buchla had produced his own compositions using tape before that, so he kind of really understood the issues that were around tape composition and so on. Wasn't just an engineer. So the primary design drivers for the Buchla music box, which later went on to become known as the Buchla 100, was a means to reduce the labour involved in splicing tape and to enable real-time improvisation of electronic music. That's kind of what they went into that process trying to achieve. The Buchla music box, delivered in 1965, included 3 separate sequencing modules, each with as many as 16 steps, representing the possibility of the equivalent of 16 slices of tape to be made very quickly using the sequences. The Buchla also included a 10-note pressure-based keyboard, not really pressure, skin contact-based keyboard. It's commonly assumed that the inclusion of the 10 notes is due to us having 10 fingers, but that's not actually true. The 10 outputs and the 10 kind of pressure panels were specifically designed to enable the dynamic control of the volume of 10 Viking tape loop decks, which the centre happened to have. So Viking tape loop decks are kind of small devices that were used in radio a lot. So you'd have like a short loop on there, and then you'd be able to kind of play commercials or little spots and so on, and it'd be kind of ready to go again, kind of like a cartridge using tape. And that particular module in the Buchla was designed to kind of control 10 VCAs so that you could have 10 loops going and be controlling the loudness of those loops in real time. So real-time interaction and performance was also a priority for the earliest Buchla designs, including components such as the Model 112, which incorporated touch plates to kind of translate pressure into voltage levels, and a Model 114, which also used touch plates to generate gate signals and distribute control voltage. Don Buchla continued to innovate and develop new interfaces, including the Thunder and Lightning MIDI controllers in the early 90s. So he had like a really big interest in performance and interaction with the instruments. But it wasn't just the Buchla that had this connection to tape practice. Robert Moog's development of the Moog synthesizer simultaneously to Buchla was similarly linked to tape-based practice. It was through an encounter with the composer Herb Deutsch that initiated the process of designing and prototyping what was to become the Moog synthesizer. Deutsch wanted a portable electronic music studio. That's what he asked Moog to kind of create. Deutsch was also seeking a more dynamic and direct relationship with electronic music making than the classical tape studio techniques allowed. An interesting fact is that the ADSR envelope was actually developed through a commission from the composer Vladimir Yusachevsky, who had specified the device to enable amplitude contouring of recorded sounds in order to speed up tape editing processes. So Yusachevsky wasn't using that classic kind of ADSR envelope as part of a synthesizer. He was using it as a standalone device, assumably with a VCA connected to it, to kind of, as he was editing tape, to be able to contour the volume of tape that he was mixing in, which I think is interesting. Do you guys have any water here? Sorry, I'm just struggling a little bit. Thanks. Okay, so another thing I'd like to talk about is indeterminacy. So I think similarly to that kind of rising interest in improvisation in the 60s, there was also this kind of increasing interest in indeterminacy in music and composition. Thank you. So I did a practice of this just before, so I've kind of been talking for 2 hours. It's not going to go for now, sorry. So composers involved in the San Francisco Tape Music Center experimented with various methods of indeterminacy in composition and performance, and they presented performances and recorded works by both John Cage and David Tudor that used indeterminacy to various degrees. Similar to improvisation, indeterminate approaches to composition raise potential issues for tape-based processes. So Cage had this desire to decouple performance from composition through chance operations. So for a composition to kind of exist, but the performances of it to each be different due to chance operations. This essentially isn't really possible with tape music as a final output, because it's always going to be the same every time you play it. So it was a bit of a, I guess, an issue there with tape music and indeterminacy as a process. Given the keen interest in the work of Cage and Tudor and indeterminacy more broadly at the San Francisco Tape Music Center, it's no surprise that the first Buchla design included a range of components to enable indeterminacy to be embedded in a patch design. So this image here, present in the first Buchla instrument, this is the Model 165 dual random voltage source. It incorporated a pair of sample and hold circuits, each combined with a noise source. So a very simple kind of way to get random voltages. Buchla went on to develop these concepts further in 1969 with the Model 265 source of uncertainty, and later the Model 266, which kind of incorporated shift register style circuits and offered a range of kind of randomized and fluid voltage outputs. Not unlike the contemporary kind of make noise woggle bug, which is a fairly well-known module that essentially has like a very similar design to that. So by situating chance operations within the device itself, Buchla enabled indeterminate kind of compositional approaches through patching to be embedded into the instrument itself, so that a live performance or improvisation could operate with and against indeterminate processes in real time. So there were basically competing kind of conceptions of what a synthesizer is or could be in the 60s. Moog was in contact with and consulted with a range of musicians and composers as he developed the instrument. And some of them, like Herb Deutsch, Walter Sear, Eric Sude, and Wendy Carlos, really encouraged Moog to incorporate a dedicated keyboard interface into the Moog instrument. But there are others, like Vladimir Yustachevsky and Moog's own employee, John Weiss, who really opposed the inclusion of a keyboard, as they believed that it would limit the possibilities of this new instrument. In the case of the Buchla, Sender unsuccessfully argued for the inclusion of a keyboard as the primary interface, as both Subotnick and Buchla kind of opposed the inclusion of a traditional keyboard. So Subotnick and Buchla agreed that the instrument was a means to break away from existing forms and processes of music, but they were not on the same page regarding more nuanced kind of intentions behind the Buchla instrument. Buchla was very concerned with its potential as a performative instrument, and he went on to kind of continue this exploration with various kind of interface designs in the 80s and 90s. Subotnick, on the other hand, viewed the Buchla instrument as a studio tool that interacted directly with tape. And you can see here he's kind of saying that I actually had a chance to interview Subotnick last year, and this is something that came out of that conversation, that he wanted the process to be like a studio-based process, and the output wasn't for an audience as such. It was to go into tape, and it was to go into record. And around that time, the record was actually a new media as well, like the LP as we know it, that can play back in stereo and so on. So he was also a massive fan of Marshall McLuhan and The Medium is the Message, so he was really interested in this LP format being kind of the output, the natural output of a synthesizer, I guess. And the natural place to hear the synthesizer would be kind of through a record player, wherever that is kind of situated. So modular synthesizers and their fixed architecture descendants became popularly associated with keyboards as their primary interface due to a range of factors, including the commercial viability of the keyboard as an easily understood interface and metaphor, and the Wendy Carlos album, Switched on Bach, which really popularized what a synthesizer was and made people kind of think of it as a keyboard instrument, I guess. In the 1970s, modular synthesizers began to fall into decline due to the introduction of smaller, less expensive instruments such as the Moog Mini Moog D and the ARP Odyssey. These new instruments largely retained the sound-generating properties of their larger predecessors, but introduced a fixed architecture, including a keyboard as a standard interface, losing a lot of the possibilities for generating and manipulating musical structure. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Silver Apples of the Moon, which is the first record made with the Buchla by Morton Subotnick. He recorded it over 13 months while he was artist in residence at New York University from 1965 to 1966. Silver Apples of the Moon was then released in 1967 on None Such Records, and was, generally considered a groundbreaking work exemplifying the possibilities of the Buchla instrument. So to create this record, he was working with multiple sequencing modules, two that had 16 stages and one that had 8 stages. And each step on these sequences was able to control 3 parameters at once. In the process of designing the Buchla instrument, they had kind of decided that 3 parameters would be sufficient to allow for timing, pitch, and volume to be defined at each step of the sequence. But later on, Subotnick regretted this decision as he realized that he'd also like to control kind of various other aspects of the timbre in this way. So it was this realization that led him to specify the Buchla instrument that he brought to New York with him to have 2 16-step sequences. Subotnick describes a process as he was recording Silver Apples of adding voltage outputs together from sequences and then having them run at odd lengths. So he'd have one running at 15 stages long and one running at 11 stages long. And so they would essentially be out of sync and would take a long time to repeat. And at each step, they would add their voltages together. And so you'd then end up with kind of like a multitude of different outputs that would take a long time to kind of cycle around. So this is something that came out of a chat that I had with him, where I'll try and I can't, I'm not sure if I get the D as well as he did. So he says that he would take whatever I wanted to do, like a tadidum, and then I would get to the D of the tadidum. I would wiggle a little thing and it would go tadidum, tadidum. Or put FM onto it and put my finger in the amount of pressure would be the amplitude of the FM. So tadidum was a freedom. So it was just playing and then recording it. So he's recalling the process of kind of improvising with the Buchla to create the record, and I would interpret that as kind of improvising, intervening into a kind of a system of obstructions and kind of there being an interaction between improvisation and musical structure. So I think this quote demonstrates the importance of improvised creation of musical phrases as structural elements, both for the design of the Buchla and also for Subotnick's intentions as a composer. The possibilities for real-time improvised interaction with the instrument, integrated with the musical structure-building aspects of the instrument, are central to Subotnick's account of his compositional process. And this is just the modules I was talking about then. You can see the 3 stages, and the module on the right is a timing generator. And so one kind of row of parameters in the sequencer would be controlling the timing of the pulses that was then kind of telling the sequencer to shift. I think that's interesting because this is essentially like the first kind of analog synthesizer sequencer created, and it's not running in a regular kind of pattern, which is kind of how sequences tend to be presented as things with kind of regular steps, and it was actually completely outside of any kind of grid at all. So another example I want to talk about is my own work. So I've tried to focus upon the modular synthesizer as a way of creating MIDI information to control other fixed architecture instruments rather than necessarily producing sounds with the modular synthesizer. And this is a deliberate strategy that I kind of use to try and help me focus on the possibilities of the creation of musical structure, separating out and effectively kind of quarantining the seemingly infinite possibilities for timbre generation with the modular synthesizer. Last year, the Australian experimental music label Room 40 released an album that I created through recordings of a MIDI controllable acoustic piano, which I think is like a pretty good example of the ideas that I've been working with. Let's see if this works. So is it? That means So the patch I use to create transductions kind of causes subtle variations to result in kind of drastic shifts in rhythm, melody, and dynamics. There's no random voltage sources used at all, and so while it's like a very complex system and the outcomes of any interventions are unpredictable and chaotic, once the changes occur, the system will kind of settle into a sort of stability. I was attracted to those processes because I liked being continually surprised by the outcomes and kind of discovering melodic and dynamic structures rather than undertaking a process of kind of preconceiving ideas and then deliberately specifying what notes I want to happen when, what loudness, etc. While the system was unpredictable, I was still able to kind of refine and limit it both by patching and performing it, kind of steering the system to aesthetic outcomes that I found pleasing. So to finish up, the desire to improvise in real time with musical structure, so not just note to note, but kind of working with larger sections of musical structure, generating and manipulating them, was a key driver and design consideration for the earliest modular synthesizer designs. The contemporary resurgence of interest in modular synthesizers has widened the use of these approaches to electronic music performance and composition that operates in real time to create musical structure. Given the role of modular synthesizers in the historic development of electronic music, this resurgence, I think, represents a return to the original conceptions of what a synthesizer might do, and more generally a shift in the role that electronic music tools play in the creation of music. While contemporary music-making tools like digital audio workstations and step-based sequencers have brought a lot of convenience to the processes of constructing kind of electronic music and constructing musical structure, I think it can also be argued that they have also imposed a conservative grid-based approach to the creation of musical structure that's almost been normalized in electronic music. The modular synthesizer resurgence shifts the possibility of electronic music towards real-time performative processes that can fluidly generate and arrange structure at various scales of music composition. And this unique musical affordance goes some way to explain the renewed popularity of these instruments. I've tried to emphasize this aspect of the modular synthesizer in this kind of presentation because I think that it challenges the normalized and popular understandings of what a synthesizer does and why they are valued, alongside attributes commonly assigned to synthesizers such as analog warmth, complex timbres, innovative control interfaces. The real-time synthesis and co-creation of musical structure is a key characteristic of the modular synthesizer. I think that the contemporary resurgence of modular synthesizers draws our attention to the real-time generation of musical structure in electronic music and should be considered a key aspect in the design and of new electronic instruments, whether they're modular, fixed architecture, hardware, or software. Thank you.
Online questions or?
Nothing so far, but if anyone, if anyone in the room has anything they want to say, or if anyone online has anything they want to say.
I'm really curious about your work with the piano. Could you speak a bit more about the process?
Yeah, so I'll just repeat that for the mic. Megan just asked about the process with recording the piano. Basically I used like a very dodgy kind of general MIDI piano and just kind of did lots and lots of recording with that, and until I kind of found some approaches that I liked. The system that I used to work with it is kind of like a weird kind of feedback system of using these kind of synced envelope generators that were kind of then, it was a very complex feedback system where I would essentially have two controls that would then kind of create massive changes, and then I'd just make smaller adjustments. No, feedback within the modular, yeah. And then once I had the kind of MIDI compositions that I was happy with, I then was able to bring it over to the University of New South Wales, and they have a MIDI controlled piano there, so I could record it there. But it was so exciting to have seeing something like moving and feeling it vibrate, and because working electronic music, I don't really get that very often. Does anyone else have anything to say?
The performance tonight was involving music,
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so yeah. So am I. Oh.
Maybe want to go and play my incense.
That's great. That's wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Cheers.
Very